Hello everyone and welcome back to Drama Made Simple. On this channel we do all things acting and talk about tons of different acting techniques. So if you're interested in seeing more of those videos, I recommend that you would subscribe and hit the notification bell down below so that you know when new videos are uploaded if you're interested in seeing more videos on acting. Today's video is going to be all about a very controversial aspect of Stanislavski's system known as emotional memory or emotional recall or affective memory. This is part of a series on this channel all about Stanislavski's system, so if you'd like to see more of those videos, I'll have the playlist linked down below so you can check those out. So just a disclaimer at the start of this video, I am not recommending that you do any of these exercises. I'm just going to describe the methods used by some other actors and explain some of the possible negative outcomes. So emotional memory is the technique whereby you use your own life experiences or memories of past events in order for you to connect to the character on an emotional level, and so that you can relate to their experiences. When this is used to connect to very happy memories, it's very simple and non-threatening tool to be used. However, often it's the case that it's used to connect to darker or more upsetting memories from your past. Because of that, if you're trying to generate these emotions inside of you, it can be a very dangerous thing to do for a number of reasons. And that's because emotional memory or emotional recall has been known to have dangerous effects such as hyperventilation, the development of depression and anxiety, panic attacks, as well as possible future use of substances. So in this video, I'm going to discuss some of the different methods that people have used surrounding emotional recall and discuss some of the possible shortfallings. So Stanislavski said that feelings from our own personal experiences transferred to the part we are playing is what gives life to the play. He said that similar to your visual memory, which will remember different things you've seen, your emotional memory will be able to remember different emotions you've experienced in the past. He said that often trying to remember different emotions will be fueled by different sensations you would have felt during the time. So using your five senses of sight, smell, taste, sound, and touch, you'll be able to add more detail to a past event and connect to the emotions of that event better. He said that you should not be using made-up feelings or borrowing other people's feelings, but really using feelings that you yourself have experienced. And he believed that if you could not connect your emotional experiences to those of the characters, then you would not be able to play that part well. So in his view, it was important that you should have experienced some emotions similar to those that the character would be going through, if you want to be able to truly recreate that character on stage. He also believed that a lot of the settings, the lighting and all of these things could be used to help you get to that emotional place. So if it was a dark and stormy night that you were trying to remember, having lights and sounds that were similar to that would be able to help the actor get into that emotional state. He said that in order to recreate emotions that you would have experienced by accident, you should look for the stimulus that would have caused you to have that emotion. Try to recreate that rather than recreating the emotion itself. He also said that we could use emotions that were generated by events we've heard about or witnessed or read about or watched on TV perhaps, not just experienced yourself. And that's something that I connect to way more, because there would be lots of things that I would see on TV or stories that I would hear about that would make me quite upset. And for me, that would be a lot more useful than trying to go back to a past memory of mine and upset myself. You can understand that from this, it's important for you as an actor to be quite an emotional being. If you want to be able to show different emotions on stage, then you need to be able to have experienced these emotions and really be able to connect to different emotions. So these are some of the things that Stanislavski said about emotional recall and emotional memory. However, when Stanislavski's system was brought to America, a lot of the main acting coaches there took different elements of Stanislavski's system and honed in on those and made those the main focus of their technique. So Lee Strasberg was one of the teachers in America who really honed in on the use of emotional recall and emotional memory. And not everybody thought that this was the correct thing to do. But I will just discuss his use of emotional recall first and then move on to what other people said about this. His use of emotional recall had a couple of guidelines to go along with it to keep it more of a safe process, given some of the dangers I've mentioned. So he said that the first few times that you use emotional recall, you should be doing so with a trained instructor in order to avoid any negative outcomes. So he said that the sessions should start with a relaxation exercise with you sitting in an armchair, and once the relaxation was complete, you would move into the emotional recall portion of the lesson. You would choose an appropriate memory and then try and remember the memory in as much sensory detail as possible. So using all of your 5 senses, trying to remember the sights, sounds, smells, tastes, and touches that you would have experienced during that time. And from describing the event in great detail, there will be usually one particular aspect of the sensory details that cause the emotion to come flooding back to you. So you can see how this would be quite dangerous to do, and I'm not recommending by any state that you should do this, because it's very possible that causing all of those emotions to come flooding back to you would have a very negative impact on you. So the exercise ends once you've found that triggering moment that causes all of the emotions to come flooding back to you. Some of the recommendations Lee Strasberg makes in order to make the experience safer for actors is to use memories that are more than 7 years old, which he believed would improve your chances of avoiding the main dangers of the affective memory lessons. Strasberg believed that using the senses and using all of these details would be less damaging than trying to force yourself to experience the emotions straight away. However, many actors who studied under Strasberg felt that this method was absolutely torturous and barbaric. One of those was Stella Adler, who eventually developed her own strain of method acting. Stella Adler said that drawing on the emotions that she had experienced, for example when her mother died, to create a role was absolutely disgraceful, and if that was acting, she didn't want any part of it. She was really unhappy with Lee Strasberg's method, and she was really unhappy that Stanislavski had caused this method to come about. So she decided to track him down and find out what his deal was. So she went to him in Paris and asked him about his method, saying that since he had come into the field of acting, she no longer enjoyed it. And it's worth noting that at this time, Stanislavski had moved away from the idea of emotional recall. So members of his troupe brought Stanislavski's system to America, I think in the 1920s, and Stanislavski was constantly refining his method. By the time that all of these larger schools were developed, Stanislavski's method had changed, and he no longer believed that emotional recall was the most viable tool to be using, especially not as the main focus of acting, which is what Lee Strasberg's method was. And it's worth noting that Lee Strasberg never trained with Stanislavski, nor did he ever meet him. He just latched on to this idea of emotional recall and used it as the main focus of his school's acting technique, and insisted that his interpretation of Stanislavski's system was the correct one. And Stella Adler really wasn't happy with this. So when she spoke with Stanislavski and learned that he no longer was interested in emotional recall, she trained with him for a while and then went back to America, where she was able to teach her own version of method acting, which was Stanislavski approved. So Stanislavski still believed that actors should be acting realistically in the unrealistic circumstances given from the character's life. And Stella Adler believes that actors should use their imagination to draw on in order to create these characters' circumstances on stage. And Stanislavski agreed with her. So she then returned to America and developed her version of method acting, which was more based on imagination as the greatest tool an actor has in order to create the character's life on stage. And a similar version of this is when Michael Chekhov was studying under Stanislavski. During an exercise, he used the memory of his father's funeral in order to create an emotional response in himself. And Stanislavski was completely blown away with his performance, and even more so when he found out that Chekhov's father was not deceased, but it was more the imagined circumstances of if his father had died and the funeral that would ensue that caused Michael Chekhov to be able to become so emotional during the scene. And that would be one of the events that would have gotten Stanislavski to understand that imagination is as key a player than using your own emotional past. So we can see that Stanislavski's first version of his system did involve emotional recall on a lot less extreme a level as did Lee Strasberg's interpretation of the system. And that when Stella Adler learned of this and was using this method and was so unhappy, she confronted Stanislavski, and at this point a lot of time had passed and he had refined his method to no longer include emotional recall. So perhaps the Strasberg method could be seen as outdated as well if we're to be following Stanislavski the whole way. And I will just mention one more version of method acting and their description of emotional memory, and that is Pooja Hagen. So she believed heavily in substitution. So when you are acting a role, you will have to make tons of substitutions in order to get yourself closer to the character's situation. And this could be for the setting, the relationships, the other characters, and anything like that. So her method was more focused on substitution than emotional memory. However, she does talk about emotional memory and sense memory. Her version of emotional memory is a bit different to Strasberg. So the way she describes it is that you should discuss with a friend or a trusted advisor a story of an unhappy event from your life, and similarly to Strasberg, to describe the details of the event in as many ways as possible using all of the senses, and eventually there will be one particular element that will trigger the sort of pain or emotional response that you would have felt during the time. And she heavily suggests that you avoid using any memories that you're not comfortable discussing or that you haven't discussed before, as it's not wise and it could have those negative outcomes that we discussed before. So she believed that you could generate this repertoire of different objects or sights or sounds that would be related to different emotions, and that you could collect these and have these in your repertoire of emotion generators. So I think her method is a lot less extreme than Strasberg's. It's more trying to get yourself to the cause of a different emotion and using that as a substitution for the emotion that the character would have felt. It seems a lot less invasive than Strasberg's method. She also discusses sense memory a lot, and that should be distinguished as emotional memory is trying to generate laughter or sobbing, some sort of emotional response, whereas sense memory will be remembering different physical sensations such as hot or cold, feeling sick or hungry or tired. And I do think that sense memory is very useful for actors to have, and starting to become much more sensually aware for if there is something that causes you to feel very strongly something, like such as hot or cold, to try and really remember the sensations of those, and even keep a journal of the different sensations, so that when you're on stage you can try and remember those when you're trying to display different sensations such as hot or cold or tired or anything like that. I do think that's a very useful skill to have. For example, when you're feeling nauseous, trying to remember the feeling in your mouth and in your stomach when you're feeling nauseous. It is quite an awful feeling and it can be quite difficult to remember, but the next time you're feeling that way, to try and think really strongly about the different things that you're feeling and try and write them down or record them in some way, so that if you have to feel those things on stage, there would be sort of a description of these things in order to help you get there, or even to just try and remember how you would be acting in those situations. So that's all I have to say about emotional recall. It's a very controversial topic in acting. It's one of the main aspects of method acting, and it's definitely something that's been criticized in the past for its potential dangers, which I have mentioned. There are certain aspects of it that I think are useful. For me, what is helpful is thinking about a story or something on TV that would have made me feel a certain way, something that I'm not personally connected to, because I think trying to draw on your own trauma isn't necessarily safe, whereas there would be, for me anyways, because I tend to be quite emotional, there's a ton of different sad stories or anything like that that would cause me to feel those emotions. For me, it makes more sense to use something that I have some distance to, because after thinking about these things, it's not something that will continue to upset me after thinking about it, even if it has made me a little bit upset. Those are quite useful to use, even if it's just in the preparatory phase for acting a particular character. I definitely think some of the mentioned negative outcomes of using emotional recall are enough of a reason for it not to be used by a ton of actors, and I think that there are some versions of method acting that are a lot more preferable than spending a lot of time thinking about negative events from your past, especially when you're on stage. If you think about the fact that in certain emotional episodes you don't know how you're going to act, and it's not really reasonable to be acting completely differently with your fellow actors on stage who are all trying to work on their parts as well night after night, it doesn't make a lot of sense to be delving into deep unfortunate emotions time and time again. So that's my view on it. What I do think is useful is to have a repertoire for yourself of substitution examples of different emotions. So if a character is feeling disappointed, think of something that could make you feel disappointed. So what I recommend is getting a notebook and on each page having a different emotion or a different sensation. So this could be an emotional memory / sensory memory notebook, and on each page have something different, such as anger, disappointment, excited, any like very specific emotion titles though, and then think of something that would make you feel that way. So an imagined circumstance that would have you feeling that way, how you would feel if something happened. So using Stanislavski's magic if, which I've mentioned before in a previous video, when you are confronted with a certain emotion, you will have this ready to go. You'll be able to look through the book and say, okay, so this is my example of what would get me feeling this way. And I think definitely using imagined circumstances is probably the best way to go. But then for the sensations, you could have more of a description of a different sensation, so that like for hot, like trying to describe how it feels when you're holding a warm cup of tea or something like that, and trying to really describe the way it feels on your hands. And those can be real descriptions as long as they're something that you're comfortable talking about. It's definitely a very controversial topic. I'm definitely not suggesting that you should do any of the emotional exercises, especially not without a qualified instructor, as Strasberg says. Let me know in the comments below what your view on emotional memory or affective memory or emotional recall is. Be really interested to see people's views on the topic and if they have any experience doing it. I would love to hear your views on it. And if you liked this video, please give it a thumbs up so that I know that you enjoyed it. And if you have any suggestions for other videos you'd like to see, please let me know in the comments below. As I mentioned at the start, this is a series on this channel where we look at different aspects of Stanislavski's system and of method acting in general. So if you'd like to see more of those videos, I'll have the playlist linked down below. Also, make sure that you subscribe and hit the notification bell so that you know when there are more videos uploaded. And I will see you guys in the next video.